Hey gang, it's KR King of D&D Homebrew, continuing my series on the Rules Cyclopedia. It's been funny looking through this well-thumbed copy of this book that I bought back in 1991. It's brought back, I'm very familiar with it, having run it for 5 years, but it's also unique in that all these, I was the only one that I ever knew that played this system. I bought it in 91, we played it with another friend of mine, and then when I went to California, everybody was playing second edition. That's what I did. On to third and fifth and whatnot and other systems, but never really ran into anybody that ran it. And then, of course, the OSR movement comes along. People are reviving the BECME system and whatnot. And the other thing is to see, going back through this, really in depth to talk about it and to see how much of this, first of all, has influenced later editions. Some of it's still here. Also, how much we had already had a homebrewed kind of system anyway, but how much we sort of incorporated those things into this system when we thought, oh, this doesn't work or this isn't explained well enough. And then finally, how the Rules Cyclopedia was that. It was just like a reference guide, and it didn't tell you how to play D&D, which was very fascinating. So today I'm going to go over movement and also the, game day turns, then encounter turns, and then finally the combat sequence when you go to those 10-second rounds, and talk about how this exactly works. I'm going to go inside the computer here and just show you what's on the screen as I go over that. It's kind of easier for me to do it that way. So I'll see you on the other side. All right, so it's the next chapter in what we've been covering here. This is movement. I'm going to do this pretty quickly. They talk about rounds, turns, and days. Rounds represent 10 seconds. Turns represents 10 minutes. And a day is a day, right? They also handle, and they talk about you can just skip time and say, 2 weeks or a month go by, and maybe you'll have things, as always in a game, that you have to think about how long would it take for things to do. But again, they cover this, which is good. Here are your distances. And again, underground, everything is measured in feet. Outdoors, it's measured in yards. And they specify this. They explain this over and over. They talk about using miniatures. They talk about their squares representing 10 feet. We always used 5-foot squares. I'll talk about that when we get into the combat situation. And another interesting thing about this, they say spells ranges also, just like movement ranges, expand to yards in an outdoor setting, but the area effects are in feet. So they say a fireball now goes 240 yards instead of 240 feet, but it has an area effect of 40 feet in diameter, which, kind of makes sense. And I talked about this movement rate when we created our characters, the encumbrance. If you get too much weight in encumbrance here based on the coins, you start to really slow down. You also have issues. A character can only take their strength times 10, whatever that is. If you have a 12 strength, that's 120 pounds. You're not going to necessarily get into that too much. That would be 1,200 encumbrance, 120. So you're going to be really slow anyway, 10 feet around. Most of the time, you're never going to get over the 801 to 1,200. And as I pointed out in mine, I tried to make it below 800. But when you start to collect stuff, treasure, for example, your movement's going to slow down. Encumbrance is a big deal in these early games. And the monsters also have the standard 120 to 40. But things change in terms of the some of them do vary, as we'll see when we go over monsters. Notice too the effects of outdoor terrain. When you're on a trail, you get 1.5, 2/3 in hill, forest, and then mountain, and glacier and whatnot. Half movement rates, really slow to go through those, and they have deadly encounters. And here you notice you have the classic clear hex travel on foot, no encumbrance. 24 miles per day, which is the same thing they have in the modern system of 5e. Whether that's accurate or not is another question. And of course, when you get into the mountains here, it's halved, and then the hills and the desert are 2/3. And then they give you rates for these animals that you can ride. And they just make a point of this no encumbrance or light encumbrance. So you heavy encumbrance, right? You do this, if you're carrying all sorts of stuff, your daily movement rate slows down as well. They have rules on resting in the system where if you go for 6 days, you got to rest for a day. Otherwise, you get -1 penalty on attack rolls and damage rolls. So, you just can't keep running forever in this system. And this is an interesting, but getting lost was a big deal in those days when you were running outside. Notice if you're in a swamp, jungle, or desert, one to three each day to see if you get lost. And we used to do hex crawls where, you would be mapping out these hexes and then you'd get it screwed up because you thought you were going northwest, but you were actually going northeast or something. And you'd have to go back and figure out your map. Getting lost was a big deal in those days. And they have rules on if you don't have any way didn't bring enough food, you got to find it in the wild. In good terrain, you have a 50% chance of finding enough food. If you just sit there for the day, you can find that. You also have the skill set, hunting skill. You start to get ravaged by hunger, again, whether you want to do that or not. And then you can just look at these later. I'm not going to go into too much of the water travel here. Again, they had rules for this kind of stuff. So now let's look at having an encounter. So there's a couple things here. As this game progressed, this is 1991 when this came out, and I feel like in the late 80s, early 90s, the game did start to change from being just a dungeon crawl game into a game where you wandered outside in the wilderness, and then you'd come to a keep or a ruin or a temple, and you'd go down and there'd be a dungeon there, but it'd be a much smaller dungeon. It wouldn't be the mega dungeons of the past. We're going to talk about both dungeons and outdoor, but notice this is the game day checklist for when you are getting ready to move through, a hex crawl. You're going to some specific destination. Sometimes we would have players just wander to explore, to try to find things. So you prepare your spells, right? Either memorizing or meditating for an hour, decide where you're going to go, see if you're lost. Then we have our daytime wandering monster. 1d6 roll. The chances depend on the terrain. And if you look, we're going to stick with this wilderness. You determine the type of terrain you're in, roll a 1d6 once during the day, and then roll a 1d12 at night. Notice in the grasslands, it's a 1 on a 1d6 or 1d12 at night. As you get into this other terrain, and then a 1 to 3 swamp, jungle, or mountain. So every day you got a 50% chance during the day. And, night encounters, we would have to have watches and people be asleep and they got to get woken up. So nighttime, they were tough. So if you don't have a wandering monster, they just travel, and then nightfall, again, you have your nightfall wandering monster, and that's it until you get to where you're want to go, or you discover something, like I said, lost temple, village, something of interest. You're going to just be running into these monsters. And then, of course, if they have a lair somewhere, these wandering monsters, that becomes something. And then we used to plug those into some preset thing. All right, then you have the game turn checklist. This is, classically when you're in a dungeon and exploring, but also out in the wilderness if you have a heavily patrolled area, or in a city or something. We switch from the game, day turn into this 10-minute turn. This is, like I said, the classic of dungeon exploration. So in the dungeon, if the wandering at the end of the previous game turn was positive, this is where they arrive. And again, if we're in a dungeon, 2d6 times 10 feet away. But let's just say there's no wandering monster right now. We're just going to be doing stuff. So if you designate a caller, describes what you're doing. We're moving down the hallway, we're listening, we're searching a room, whatever. The DM then describes the results. If they enter a new area, describes it so the mapper can then map it. And if an encounter occurs, you go to the encounter checklist. But otherwise, you go to the end, you check for the random monster. 1d6 every other turn to check for this, right? It's every 2 turns when you're in the game turn checklist as opposed to once per day outside. Again, you can get encounters in the dungeon, you'll roll a 1 out of 6 every once in a while, right? So then you have surprise. And notice it's a 1/3 chance, 1 or 2 on a 6-sided die that you are surprised. And one of these things was when we used to say you listen at a door, everyone is quiet, you listen to the door. If you hear something, you could not be surprised, right? That was the idea. But of course, first of all, you might not hear anything. And second of all, if they heard you, they might get quiet depending on what the animal was. So sometimes listening at the door, that thief ability, wasn't necessarily perfect for eliminating surprise. There were people that used to claim that would be, again, you just always roll for surprise because you listened, didn't hear anything. Maybe you made the roll, but they were quiet or whatever. And that was just worked into that die roll. You can decide what you want to do in this. But for now, let's just say you're going to roll every time when you come up into a new room or come through a doorway or whatever, and there's monsters or whatever in there, NPCs, you roll. If neither group is surprised, you're just aware of each other. You both heard it. If both groups are surprised, you just sort of look at each other like, oh my God, what's going on? And then the classic is one group is surprised and the other one gets to move first, right? Or run away and evade. Now, this is tricky if the one group is surprised because it says you can take advantage of this by just evading. Well, if you burst a door open and surprise them, it seems to me that wouldn't exactly be, you couldn't necessarily evade them. You get around or run away, but they'd know you were there, right? But whereas if you see them in the distance, like outside or something, or down a hallway or something, if you've got, your torches or infravision, but you got torches, they're going to see those, right? So let's say infravision or something. Again, this is a little murky here because when they say automatic success, only if they don't see you. So notice there's 3 ranges, possible ranges. If you have a well-lit dungeon, it's 46 times 10. Dim light, or if you've got infravision in a dark dungeon, 2d6 times 10. And then no light at all, and no one has infravision. You're just literally walking through the dark, 1d4 times 10. So you could be 10 feet away when you bump into things. And then we have the wilderness things in terms of that light, and ocean and sea. So if you have an encounter, you go from the 10-minute game turn to the 10-second encounter rounds. And you don't have to inform them of this because if they're surprised, right, they don't see anything. Now, notice an interesting thing about surprise here. You roll the 1d6, 1 or 2, you're surprised. If one side is surprised, it loses initiative automatically, which means that the other guys get a round to react with you doing nothing. And maybe they run away, right, if you don't see them. But they could move, attack, and get another round. That's what that system says. You can decide how you want to do that, but that's what it says. And then basically what happens, whether it's the PC's triggering your trap, you're role-playing a conversation, or a fight breaks out. If you're running away, make a morale check. Or if they might run away, do you chase them? And then basically if you have a battle, you go to the combat sequence checklist. And then after the encounter ends, you go back to the game turn system. Now, even though it says this initiative thing, we didn't do it this way. We just said you get a round of surprise, and then we roll initiative. Just because 2 turns seemed a bit much. But you can do it. That's what the rules as written say to me, but maybe you just interpreted it. We just said, nah, that seems a little much. You get your surprise, then let's roll initiative. They also have this chart for monster reaction, right? 2d6. 2 or 3, they automatically attack. Up to 12, they're friendly. Now, the question here is, as they say with all things, is that, if you have a cowardly monster, it might flee, or instead of being aggressive and growling, then you roll again, right, with a -4 penalty, and it's probably going to attack. Then you cautious or whatever, you get a +4, whatever. So, but the thing about this is when you look at the monsters, whether necessarily they are going to do this attack. So let's say we look at something like a Bugbear here. Its alignment is chaotic. It's described as they sneak up on people. They kill and eat herd animals and sometimes raid farmers' storage sheds. And in times of great hardship, they may kill humans for food. They're basically intelligent and they know how to use superior weapons. So you would say that this, even though it's a chaotic monster, even though you may think of bugbears as just attack, when you go to these encounter tables, and I just say, okay, I'll roll a 2 6-sided dice. I have a 9. Look at that. They're cautious. So it depends on, do the players attack the bugbears? Do they, try to talk to them, whatever? Then we roll another one, let's say. So we say, okay, another round. They're going to go 1, 2, and 11. They're neutral. So depending on what the players are doing, if they're not attacking, if they're still questioning and talking or whatever, then you roll again at +4. 7 + 4, 11, right? They're still neutral, whatever. You're still going to be rolling. And meanwhile, then the players at this point might just say, you know what, we're going to leave, right? And they may have said it after the second round. We're not interested in fighting these bugbears. But the players could just attack. The bugbears are chaotic. They're known to raid, farms and stuff. So, but again, you can get into a situation with something like a bugbear where you're not just having a battle. And here are your wandering monsters table. I'm going to use this to create an encounter when we get into the battle with the 5 characters that I created. And this has the classic, as you go deeper into a dungeon, You go to the 6th level and you're running into Basilisk, Hellhounds, a Stone Giant, Hydra. These are nasty monsters, right? What do they have at the 8th and 10th here? Basically, you've got Spectre, Vampire, Dragon, all this, everything is killer. These wilderness and tables, we never used these. We had our own that we had developed over the years that were much more detailed, that went through all the different monsters in the monster manual. But again, here you go. You go to, let's say, I'm at clear, and I roll a flyer. Then you go down, and here you've got the flyers. So you roll another 1d12 to see what that is. Now, they had rules for evasion and pursuit, and part of this reflected the idea that you didn't always want to be attacking things, right? Battles were deadly. You didn't have a lot of spells, especially first level. You don't have any heals. So anything you do, one battle can end things. You may want to run away. All right, so what happens is they encounter each other, and one or both parties say, I'm getting out of here, right? Now, again, if the evading party is not surprised, the other party is surprised, it says evasion occurs automatically, which is curious to me if you've broken a door, but let's just ignore that. So basically, if the players run away, the monsters have to make a morale check, and on a successful morale check, they decide to pursue, which I assume a success is they want to attack. It's a negative reaction. Doesn't really say in here, right? And basically, as you can see, they've got the rules for the party size, chance of evasion, effects of terrain, of speed, right? Because what will happen is they'll just give up because they can't catch you. So now we come to combat, which is, in many ways, the essential part of a D&D campaign. A lot of people say, oh, no, it's role-playing, it's exploration, or it's, all three. But let's face it, a big part of having our characteristics, spells, weapons is to fight things. And as I mentioned, there's a simplicity to the Rules Cyclopedia, especially for later systems. One might argue in terms of the early ones, this one, because it combines everything, gets more complex. As with all things, as we've seen, you are expected to know something about playing Dungeons & Dragons in order to run this, as opposed to the original box set, the Beckme's, where it was much more explaining how this worked as they went along. Now, the thing is, when you go to the encounter checklist, you move from the 10-minute turns to the 10-second rounds. It is different from the combat sequence just because you may not have combat, right? After you've done the surprise roll and initiative, if someone runs away, whether it's the PCs, the monsters, or both, you then go back to the standard 10-minute game time turn. If they decide to have a battle, we go to the combat sequence checklist. And here again, if no one has been surprised, you roll initiative for each side. You could do, they talk about it optional to have individual, but we always played this one side versus the other. And so then you have the first side. You have the optional morale rule. I'll talk about that in a second. Then you have movement, and you can choose to move however your movement. There's no restrictions, in terms of, opportunity attacks, anything like that. You move however you want to move. Then you have missile combat, which is arrow fire or thrown weapons. Make your targets and make your rolls. Then magic, where you either cast a magic spell or you use a magic item. And then finally, hand-to-hand combat, right? You choose your target, you make your rolls, then the second side goes, and if you have any special results, someone's been paralyzed or charmed, or some effect of something, poison arrow, you announce that, and then you go back to the next round, right? Or the next side goes. As I mentioned, they not only the individual initiative option, but they also allow for dexterity, can modify your initiative roll if you want to use those penalties on there. We also have the morale rule, which is an optional rule. Basically, you roll 2d6 against a creature's morale score. It's got to be equal to or less than the morale score. And you do have a lot of monsters, like an invisible stalker has a 12 morale. You cannot make it run away. It's committed to attacking, right? They say if they hit things with a 2, run away automatically. And the only question with this optional rule is when you roll it, you make that decision, whether it's when someone gets hit, every 5 combats, if a creature is reduced to 1/4 of its points, you can do it for if half the group or something, however you want to do that. This is one of these things where it's probably more realistic to run this because, you get these campaigns where people just, everything fights to the death, and I'm always like, not, like, again, an invisible stalker or something. And the things, when you look at the monster tables, they're pretty realistic. So, for example, a manticore has a morale of 9. It's probably going to hang around, but it's not necessarily, just going to fight to the death. If it sees, oh, things are going badly, it's been hit a few times, or it's more than half, something like that, whatever you decide, it just says, I'll fly away and, live to fight another day. Notice with men, a brigand has an 8. They're probably going to stick around. Buccaneer, 6 or 7, depending on if they have a leader. They're much more prone to running away. And then the dervish, with a 10, it's a fanatical fighter. So we learned about movement in terms of encumbrance and how much you could move in an encounter that, it had that smaller number there. Most of the players are going to be 40 or 30, depending on their encumbrance, or 20 if you're really encumbered. Running speed goes back to your turn speed, but you can't use that if you're engaged in combat. Then you go back to your round speed and you have to use half or more to run away, or a 5 foot for a retreat, as we'll see. Because we have our combat maneuvers. And these are either missile combat magic or hand-to-hand, and these are just basically things you can do. You can throw something, missile fire your crossbow or your bow, cast a spell, or use a magic item. And here's the list of them. The combat, throw something and fire. And here's the list of combat maneuvers. You can throw something in the missile phase, fire a crossbow or longbow, cast a spell, or use a magic item in the magic phase. And then the various attack, fighting, withdrawal, 5 foot at a time, a retreat, half or more of your movement. And we get into lance attack and set spears attack when something versus a charge. Then these other ones, multiples, are special smash and parry for higher level characters. So looking at this missile combat, you're going to have a bonus based on your dexterity. The magic, and these phases are pretty much self-explanatory, right? And the phases, so the combat phases are pretty self-explanatory. With missile, magic, you look at the spell, and then you have hand-to-hand at the end here. You can throw spells when you're engaged with something. The only thing is the missile combat. If you're within 5 feet, you can't use missiles. You can't use... The only thing with missile combat, if you're within 5 feet, you can't use them. So we used to use 5 foot squares, kind of based on this, but also just our experience of how big a 10-foot area was to have one thing in there, or do you put multiple, figures or whatever in that 10-foot space. So we used 5 foot squares, and that was part of the reason. Then we have hand-to-hand combat. So you're going to look at the THAC0 table that we showed here. This is all the players are going to have this THAC0. Most of the monsters that they run into are going to have this unless they have a higher hit dice. It's all based on hit dice. And we're not using the weapon mastery. There can be exposure if you're using missile fire and you're only exposed for part. So basically you roll as an attacker a 1d20, add the bonuses, your strength for melee attacks, dexterity for missile or thrown, any magic bonuses if you've got a magic spell that helps your attack roll. Then you subtract any penalties, cover if you're using that, magic curses if you've been cursed or something, someone threw a reverse spell and you're taking negative. If you equal or exceed the number you need on the THAC0 table, you've hit. Now you roll damage, damage listed for the weapon or the attack, and then you adjust with any multipliers. If you have a strength bonus or subtraction, if the thief is backstabbing, the extra die. They have the charge bonus for some of these, and magic bonuses if you have weapons or magic spells that affect that. This is the standard chart when they've converted this over to a D20 system. And they do have some adjustments here. You have circumstance bonus, if you're attacking from behind, you get a +2 because you're ignoring their shield. If you can't see the target, they're invisible, let's just say -4 penalty. Larger than man-sized attacks a halfling always gets a -1. The target's exhausted. That's we talk about running. If you run over a certain amount of time, you get a bonus, and the attacker exhausted. Again, you got to have these modifiers. So they're not that difficult in terms of think of all the conditions and stuff you have, say, in a 5e type system. Missile combat, you just have the dexterity bonus or subtraction. Short range, you get a +1. Medium, there's no adjustment, and then long is -1. Now, when you look at cover, you know, if you're hiding behind a table or chair or a tree or boulder, this is, you know, the GM has to make this decision. So and then they talk about soft cover and hard cover. So if you're hiding bushes or tapestries are soft, and then how much are they covered? These are things that you have to sort of make that decision as a GM. And here's that rule about targets within 5 feet. Can't use your missile fire. Unless they are tied down, held down, or whatever, then you can shoot them at 5 feet. Magic is pretty much standard. Here's the saving throw list. We went over those in the equipment. And they literally like to emphasize maximum damage produced by any single spell is 20 dice. They have some optional rules for 2 weapons combat. You also have striking and wrestling and all this kind of stuff. If you want to use those, you can look through those. You don't need them in the original system. Wrestling, boxing. They talk about aerial combat and whatnot. Underwater combat. So there you have it. You have the combat system broken down. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to take those 5 characters that I rolled in an earlier video, put them on something, probably Owlbear Rodeo or something where you can see them in a dungeon environment and just run out some encounters, see how it works, how the combat system works, the monsters going back and forth. Not having a healer at first level will be interesting. And then I'll talk about some monsters, you know, I'll talk about experience, the different ways. It's interesting how they describe different ways to do experience. You'd be surprised. And of course, famously, treasure is part of that. We'll see how the monsters, there's some deadly monsters that in and of themselves have very little experience value. And then I'll talk about some of the rules, optional rules, and things in the DM guide that very much reflect modern sensibilities in playing a D&D style game. But until then, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe to my channel. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. I'd love to hear about anyone out there, as I said, who's actually played the Rules Cyclopedia in a campaign. But most importantly, as always, keep playing a role-playing game and tell somebody else about it.